for part one of the this episode. What I want to talk about is sort of my experience dealing with trying to have conversations with. I mean, I don't know for sure because that's kind of the point of what I'm sort of complaining about, but trying to have conversations with Trump supporters. So I mentioned on my last episode, and I got frustrated about sort of a different thing then, but I've been volunteering with the Leadership Lab at the Los Angeles LGBT Center. And what they do is they do these canvases, which right now they've done things on transgender rights, they've done things on abortion, they've done sort of canvases on gay marriage, and right now they're doing canvases on sort of racial prejudice and race-based issues. And how their work goes is we go to an area that we know is sort of against our opinion with certain things. So, like for example, we went to Santa Clarita, which was a predominantly Trump voting community during this past election, and we go there and we try to have conversations with Trump voters. And how we do that is we go knock on their door and we say, hey, I'm a volunteer for the Leadership Lab and I'm here to just talk to you about, just talk to you about the election and sort of your opinions on it and just whoever you voted for and try and talk to you. We very much, especially since this is technically a nonpartisan group, we're not supporting one way or the other. And our goal with these conversations is not to come in and be like, you should feel really bad about having done that. What our goal is to go and have a meaningful conversation with someone, and be vulnerable ourselves, be really open and really vulnerable about our experiences and our thoughts and things that we've dealt with, or even things that we've done to, especially for the transgender one. When we were talking about transgender rights, I talked about my experience as a trans person. But for this one, for the race-based prejudice, the story that we were telling, I mean, they had several different types of stories to tell, but one of the stories that we were telling was basically being like, especially for someone who, I'm white, was telling an experience of how I made presumptions about race. And I would tell a story about, how, like in high school, I made presumptions about some, I guess I'll admit it on here, but it's kind of easy to do it door to door, but I'll be vulnerable on this podcast. And sort of, when I was in high school or middle school, elementary school, we didn't have many people of color in our school. It's mostly predominantly white school. Also a lot of Hispanic people as well, because it was a sort of more farming community. And there weren't many African American people, not many people of color. And because of that, when I would go into, like when I hit college or when I would go into like the city or something like that, when I would go into a place that was predominantly not white, regardless of who it was, it could be, anybody. If it was a predominantly not white place, I felt uncomfortable and I felt scared. And I had to sort of realize that I had my own internalized racism. Because it didn't matter who they were, it was just that they were black, that they were people of color, and I felt uncomfortable because of that. And I had to admit that to myself and had to admit that that's something I need to work on, and that's something I have to deal with every single day. And the only way you can do that is the only way you can deal with that sort of thing, the only way you can address it is if you admit it. If you admit, I have this issue, we all have this issue, everyone, I'm the most liberal person you could probably meet, and even I have this sort of internalized racism, is what it is. I mean, I'm not going to, I would hope that I don't go out and say really racist things. Maybe I've made mistakes here or there, slipping up on certain things. But overall, I feel like I'm pretty good consciously about it. But unconsciously, I do have internalized racism because of just how society's taught me and how I grew up and people who I grew up with. Not that they were necessarily overtly racist either. But again, same sort of thing. So we wanted to go to the door and admit this and like actually have a conversation with people about it and get people thinking about it, because the goal of these conversations is to sort of change people's minds, but not in a way that's like trying to beat them over the head with our opinions. It's really more about opening up, being vulnerable, sharing our life story, and then trying to get them to talk about their life stories as well. And trying to be like, hey, I'm vulnerable. Have you ever experienced something like that? And can you make a connection to maybe that's how black people feel, or maybe that you've made that assumption about black people, or anything like that. And hopefully change people's minds by doing that, or at least get them thinking about it. The goal is to at least get them thinking about it and have the conversation. Like, even if they don't necessarily change their mind right then, at least it sticks with them. So this is the experience that we were trying to do. And the thing that I came up against when I tried to go door to door in this Trump County is I got so many people telling me that they didn't want to express their opinions. And on one hand, like, I got several people that's like, oh, I have a lot of opinions. Like, I got this quote several times, and it surprised me. It's like, I have a lot of opinions, very strong opinions. I don't want to talk about them. I don't like. I literally got people saying, like, don't talk about it. Never talk about politics with anybody. And on one hand, I get that, and I understand that. I'm this sort of liberal kid coming up into your neighborhood on a Saturday morning when you probably wanted to be doing other things, and trying to have this really in-depth conversation with you. And I think also the way that I couched it, I would always start the conversation with, I'm here to just talk about your feelings about the election. And the election is such a charged word, and I look like transgender liberal person. It automatically seems like I'm coming in to come and talk on my huge high horse of being like, yeah, racism is bad, and blah blah blah. Like, it feels like I'm gonna try and come in there and make them feel bad for being Trump voters, which isn't the goal. Like, I disagree with Trump. I'm very scared of Trump. I have my own personal stuff with Trump, which I've expressed on this podcast numerous times, but I'm not. My goal wasn't to go in there and shame anybody. My goal was to go in there and be like, "Hey, I have these problems too. Let's talk about it. Let's share. Let's try and grow as people." So on one hand, I get it. I get that that's something you don't really want to do on a Saturday morning with a complete stranger on your doorstep. But some of the reactions that I got really surprised me. I had people literally close doors in my face after 2 seconds. I had people, like, there was one person who came out and says, "We're not interested," and then slammed the door in my face. And then I started walking away, and then another person in the house came out and said, "Oh, what are you here for?" And I said, "Oh, I said what I was there for." And they're like, "Oh, we don't want to talk about it." So it sort of felt like, oh, you were willing to have a conversation, just not this one. Another person ran away from me when he heard what I was here talking about. There was two people out having a conversation, and I walked up to them saying, hey, sorry to interrupt your conversation. If you just have a minute, I want to blah, 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 my whole spiel. And then he's like, nope, and just ran away. And I watched him watch me from behind, like, a lawn, like he was scared of me. And as soon as I walked away, because the other lady didn't want to talk either, he came back. And it just felt weird that someone was scared of it. Was like a visceral fear of having this conversation. And then there was another person who was just like, respect our opinion. Our opinion is we don't want to talk about it. And that one really frustrated me, because that's not an opinion. Not wanting to talk about something isn't an opinion. And I get it. On an individual basis, every single door I went up to individually, I get it. But the fact is, I only had 2 conversations that day, and they were both with people that already agreed with me, Hillary supporters. And while it was important to have those conversations, I didn't really change anybody's minds, because they sort of agreed with me. And it felt really frustrating, and really angering to be. I feel like I've come all this way. I've come out here. I woke up at 7 in the morning. I've driven all this way to try and have this conversation, and I'm being completely shut out. And I feel like this is the conversation that's the most important one to have. Not shaming, not anger, not anything like that, but trying to connect across the boundaries. Because if we just stick in our bubbles, like, that's what I'm frustrated with these people about, is that and even liberals do this too. I do it too. I've been guilty of it, is we tend to stay in talking with our own groups that already agree with us. And it's really, really important, especially right now, to try and have a conversation and meet in the middle and talk about something that we share in common and can actually just discuss in a very open, vulnerable way. And to completely shut people out and saying we don't talk about it and stay in your own little conservative bubble, or even your own liberal bubble with a lot of these protests. And I think the protests are important. The Women's March is important. But again, it's like a lot of liberals getting together to express liberal values, yelling at conservatives. And, people in Washington, like Trump and things like that, they're conservatives in their own conservative bubble, saying things and yelling back instead of actually having a conversation. It's just screaming at each other. So it's really important to have these conversations, and I've just felt so frustrated and honestly impotent. I honestly had to sit down and cry because it's like I really, really want to have this conversation. More than anything in the world, I just want to have this conversation. And I put forth the maximum amount of effort that I possibly can. I've woken up early. I've come out here. I've prepared. I've tried to be vulnerable. I've tried to be open. I'm prepared to cry on your doorstep, if that's what happens. And I go through all that, and I just hit a wall. I feel like I'm hurling myself at this wall, and nothing's happening. And, it's just frustrating because I'm willing to just go in there and it's like, hey, I'm racist too. Let's talk about it. Let's be open and vulnerable about it. And even I know, and I talked about this in my last podcast, but it had happened again this weekend, and I'm a white person being able to have this conversation. There was black people in our, people of color in our group going up to these doors, and there was one person that had the cop called on them because they were scared of them being African American in their neighborhood. And it's frustrating to feel like we can't have this conversation because I feel like it's so important to have this conversation. It's probably the most important conversation we could be having right now. So this past weekend, it was just really, really frustrating. And I encourage all of you listening, whether you're liberal, conservative, whoever, you agree with Trump, disagree with Trump, go out and find somebody that you disagree with and don't talk about Trump. Don't talk about the big sort of policies and things about that. Talk about your personal experience, things that you yourself have experienced in your everyday life that may relate to this. Even if it's just like, oh, I think, I think this is really, again, I'm putting judgments on it, but I think this is sort of not something that's good to say. But even if you're sort of like, oh, I think, people of color should work harder because they to overcome racism they just need to work harder and really want it more. Even if that's your opinion, have a conversation with that and be like, hey, I see, I don't know, people of color being lazy and I see it in my everyday life. Talk about that experience with somebody and why you have that opinion, and hopefully that person who disagrees with you can share their thoughts and their opinion, and maybe you can come to some sort of consensus about it. I don't care if you're the most. No one actually thinks of themselves as racist, very rarely. But I don't care if you're the most racist, most conservative, most evil person, whatever, coming up to me. And I know I'm privileged to be able to say that because I know you're probably not going to hurt me because I'm white, maybe as a transgender person. But I'd rather you come up and say those views to me than not talk to me at all. I'd rather have the conversation. Because then it is a conversation instead of just a yelling match, or we're just like, oh yeah, you're saying something, I'm not listening, I can just ignore you. I even had that in my own personal life today, where I was screaming at somebody. No, we didn't hear each other. I was having an argument with my roommate, and we were screaming at each other. We didn't hear each other. We went away, went back to our rooms, and then I came out and cried and was like, I'm sorry. And we actually hurt each other. We admitted that both of us did things wrong. So if you just scream at each other, nothing happens. If you talk about it, it gets better. And you at least come to some sort of consensus. So, yeah, I think that's really important to do. And I wanted to express that with you.